All right, welcome back, grade 10s. This is our bridge to Social 20. In Social 20, instead of studying globalism, you study nationalism. So today, to some extent, we're going to see how the two concepts overlap. Logically, the first thing we need to do is define what is nationalism. This website, Serious Science, with Richard Burke, looks at what is nationalism. So I just had you kind of skim through this and see if you can come up with some key terms. So in your notes, we are asking you to take some notes on nationalism. If you create a web with nationalism in the middle and some ideas coming off of it, that might work for you. Or if you want to just have some jot notes where you have the term nationalism up at the top and some ideas that are attached to nationalism below that, that also works for me as well. But what I'd like you to be able to do is leave here with some understanding what is nationalism. So, the historian here talks about different components of nationalism. But one of the key words that comes up a lot is allegiance. So when I think of nationalism, I think of allegiance. I think of loyalty. I think of patriotism. I think of identification. Nationalism is a piece of our collective identity. So with identification, at the beginning of Social 20, when you study nationalism, when you define it, we're going to say there's lots of different types of nations. You can have religious nations. You can have social nations. You can have economic nations. You can have ideological nations. You can have geographic and ethnic and linguistic nations. And each one of these nations is simply a group that have some kind of common piece of identity. So a linguistic nation would be, for example, francophones. They identify with the language they speak. Or anglophones. They identify with the language they speak. And ethnic nation, their identity might be defined by their genetics, by their ancestors, by their makeup, whereas a historic nation might be, we share some kind of narrative. We have the same tale, we have the same folklores. Religious identification, we worship the same god or gods. So a key part of nationalism is identification. Which groups do you identify with? And again, it could be a linguistic identification, could be a religious identification, could be a ethnic or historical, cultural identification. There's many different ways for us to define nationalism. Often when we think of nationalism, we just think of the Canadian flag. And Canada is a nation, but that's only one example of a nation. There's many, many other examples. So identification is part of nationalism. We can also talk about this element of loyalty. So what is nationalism? It's more than just I feel myself to be an Anglophone, but that connection that I have, that collective identity of Anglophones, there's a loyalty to it. It's more than I'm just attached to it, that there's something like I'd like to defend it. I'd like to promote it. I'd like to honor it. I'd like to strengthen it. That it's important to me. So it's identification, but it's also loyalty. And with loyalty can become an expression of patriotism. Patriotism can be an expression of loyalty. And taken to an extreme, like you'll see in Social 20, that can lead to ultranationalism and violence. So, what is nationalism? It's about allegiance. It's about identification, which can create ideas of which groups are you loyal to? And sometimes we express that through patriotism. Another term that comes up here from the historian is popular sovereignty. That Richard Burke is suggesting that one of the key components of nationalism is popular sovereignty. So in Social 20, we begin the course with a study of feudalism, the old regime, and the causes of the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, sovereignty in France reigned with the king, and he was chosen by God. He had the divine right to rule. So the power of the king came from God, not from the people. Last night during the election, a lot of the times the analysts kept saying, well, we're going to count all the votes because this is an expression of the will of the people. We heard the phrase will of the people lots last night. Well, what is the will of the people? That's popular sovereignty. That means the government is legitimate if they answer to the people. So an element of modern nationalism is that it's the people of the nation, not God, who empowers the government. That the power resides in the people. Popular sovereignty. The sovereignty, the independence, the autonomy, the power of the populace, the power of the individuals, people like you and me. So that's an element of modern nationalism, as expressed in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille. Although you can have nationalism that's not a democracy, this guy talks a little bit about the links between nationalism and democracy. One last thing we'll mention before moving on to the next part of the assignment is Richard Burke talks about how nationalism has been the language that we use as we, in the global market. He doesn't say global market or global village, but in this global arena, nationalism is often the language we use to really sort through others. Are they my friends or foe? Well, let's see if their nationalism's opposed to mine. So next year, in 20, you'll see the First and Second World Wars as consequences of nationalism. Because of nationalism, we had rival camps. And because nationalism was the way we expressed ourselves in the emerging global village, it caused conflict. So that's an introduction to nationalism. The next part of the assignment, continuing on with this document, Lesson 24, Contemporary Studies, the Rebirth of Nationalism. I can see some of your name popping up there. I've got a rather lengthy article here now for you. And it's going to be looking at the conflict between globalism and nationalism. I'd like you to skim through it. Not reading to memorize. You're not reading to memorize. You're skimming to see the big picture, the theme. Yes? Okay, I'll be there in a second. So if I can get you guys to skim through that, that's the next part of understanding what is nationalism and understanding this idea that in the global village today, we're seeing a rebirth of nationalism. And what might that mean? What might that mean for globalism? So if I can get you to read through that article, and by read and really skim through it, seeing if you can see the conflict between nationalism and globalism.